The letter arrived on a blistering July afternoon in 1875, the same day that Lincoln Zachary buried his hopes alongside his father beneath the unforgiving Texas sun. Standing at the edge of the grave, his weathered Stetson clutched against his chest, Lincoln realized he was now alone in a house built for a family, on a ranch that had consumed his father's life and would now demand his. 2 days later, as dust swirled through Kingfisher, Texas, Lincoln sat in the town's single-room post office, staring at the letter from Miss Katherine Anderson, the woman who had answered his advertisement for a bride. Her penmanship was neat, her words measured and proper. She would arrive on the next month's train from Boston, ready to begin their life together. Lincoln had never expected to find himself seeking a mail-order bride. At 32, he had focused on helping his father run their modest but successful cattle ranch, 10 miles outside of town. Marriage had seemed a distant concern until his father's passing made the emptiness of the house unbearable. The sound of his own footsteps echoing through the rooms had driven him to place the advertisement. "She sounds like a fine woman," said Postmaster Jenkins, who had a habit of commenting on the correspondence that passed through his hands. "Yes," Lincoln agreed, though in truth, the letter revealed little beyond her acceptance of his proposal and her travel plans. She was 25, had worked as a schoolteacher, and was, in her own words, seeking the opportunity of a new beginning in the West. August arrived with relentless heat, and the date of Katherine's arrival. Lincoln had spent weeks preparing the ranch house, repairing furniture, cleaning rooms that had gathered dust since his mother's death 10 years earlier. He'd even purchased a small bookshelf from the general store, recalling Katherine's mention of her love of literature. The train pulled into Kingfisher's station with a screech of metal and a billow of steam. Lincoln stood on the platform, freshly shaved, wearing his best shirt and vest, a small bouquet of wildflowers gathered from the creek bank clutched in his hand. His heart hammered against his ribs as passengers began to disembark. She was the last to step down, assisted by the conductor. Katherine Anderson stood on the platform, a slender woman in a blue traveling dress, her chestnut hair tucked neatly beneath a modest hat. She clutched a carpetbag in one hand and a parasol in the other. Her face was pale, her eyes wide as she surveyed her surroundings, darting from the dusty street to the weathered buildings to the faces of strangers. Lincoln approached her slowly, removing his hat. "Miss Anderson." "I'm Lincoln Zachary." Her eyes met his briefly before lowering to the platform. "Mr. Zachary," she replied, her voice barely audible above the noise of the station. "Welcome to Kingfisher." He offered the wildflowers with an outstretched hand. She accepted them with trembling fingers. "Thank you." Lincoln loaded her trunk onto his wagon and helped her climb onto the seat beside him. The ride to the ranch was quiet, Katherine's responses to his attempts at conversation brief and strained. He attributed her reticence to the fatigue of travel, and perhaps the overwhelming nature of her decision to marry a stranger in an unfamiliar land. The ranch house came into view as they crested a small rise. It wasn't grand, a 2-story structure built of sturdy pine with a wide porch wrapping around the front and one side. A barn and corral stood nearby, and beyond them, the pastures stretched toward the distant hills. "This is it," Lincoln said. "It's not much compared to what you're used to in Boston, but it's solid. My father built it himself 20 years ago." Katherine nodded, her gaze fixed on the house. "It looks comfortable." Lincoln helped her down from the wagon and carried her trunk inside. He showed her to the bedroom he had prepared, formerly his mother's sewing room, now outfitted with the best linens he could find and a vase of fresh flowers on the dresser. "I thought you might like to rest before dinner," he said. The journey must have been exhausting. Yes, thank you. Katherine stood in the center of the room, still clutching her parasol like a shield. I'll be outside tending to the horses if you need anything. Lincoln closed the door behind him, giving her privacy. He spent the next hour in the barn, brushing down the horses and reflecting on their first meeting. She seemed frightened, which he supposed was natural. In time, he hoped, she would grow comfortable in her new home and with him. When he returned to the house to prepare dinner, he found the bedroom door still closed. He knocked gently. "Miss Anderson, I've prepared some food if you're hungry." There was a long pause before her voice came through the door. "I'm afraid I'm not feeling well. The journey was difficult." "Perhaps tomorrow." "Of course. Would you like me to bring something to your room?" "No, thank you. I just need rest." Lincoln ate alone at the kitchen table, the silence of the house weighing heavily upon him. He had imagined this night differently, conversation over dinner, perhaps learning more about each other, taking the first tentative steps toward building a life together. Instead, he found himself with more questions than answers about the woman who had traveled across the country to be his wife. The following morning, Lincoln rose at dawn as usual. He knocked softly on Katherine's door with a cup of coffee in hand. "Miss Anderson, I've brought you some coffee." Again, her voice came through the closed door. "Please leave it outside the door. I'll retrieve it shortly." Lincoln placed the cup on the small table in the hallway. "I'll be making breakfast soon, eggs and biscuits." "Thank you, but I'm still not feeling well," Lincoln frowned. "Is there anything I can do? Fetch the doctor from town?" No, it's just, I need time. Time." Lincoln could understand that. He went about his morning chores, checking on the cattle in the nearest pasture, repairing a section of fence that had come loose. When he returned to the house mid-morning, the coffee cup was on the table, empty, but Katherine's door remained firmly closed. This pattern continued for 3 days. Katherine would accept food left outside her door but refused to emerge or to allow Lincoln to enter. Their only communication came through the solid oak barrier between them. On the 4th day, Lincoln's patience began to fray. He knocked firmly on her door after breakfast. "Miss Anderson, I understand that this situation is difficult, but we cannot continue this way indefinitely. I'm concerned about your well-being." There was a long silence before she responded. "I apologize for my behavior, Mr. Zachary. I'm not what you expected, I'm sure." Her words surprised him. "I had few expectations beyond meeting the woman who was brave enough to travel alone across the country to marry a stranger." He heard movement inside the room, footsteps approaching the door, but it remained closed. "I thought I could do this," she said, her voice closer now. "I thought I could leave everything behind and start anew, but since arriving, I've found myself paralyzed with fear." Lincoln leaned against the wall beside her door. "What are you afraid of, Miss Anderson?" "Everything," she whispered. "This land is so vast, so wild. The town is nothing like Boston, and you're a stranger to me." Lincoln nodded, though she couldn't see him. "Yes, I am, and you're a stranger to me, but we won't remain strangers if we never speak face to face. I need more time." Lincoln sighed. "Very well, but please know that I have no intention of harming you. When you came here, I promised to provide for you and protect you. That promise stands, whether you choose to marry me or not." There was a soft sound from the other side of the door, perhaps a sob quickly stifled. "Thank you, Mr. Zachary. Your kindness is more than I deserve." "Lincoln," he corrected gently. "If we're to be friends at the very least, I'd prefer you call me Lincoln." "Lincoln," she repeated, her voice warming slightly. "And I'm Katherine." It was a small victory, but Lincoln would take it. "Well, Katherine, I have work to do on the ranch today, but I'll be back this evening. If you need anything, there's food in the kitchen and fresh water in the pump outside." "Thank you." Lincoln went about his day's work, his mind constantly returning to the woman in the house. What had happened to make her so afraid? Was it simply the shock of the frontier after living in a city like Boston, or was there something deeper troubling her? That evening, after returning from checking the far pasture, Lincoln was surprised to find a plate of food waiting for him on the kitchen table. It was a simple meal, bread and cheese, but it had been set out carefully, with a note beside it. "I found some supplies in the pantry. It isn't much, but I wanted to thank you for your patience." Katherine Lincoln smiled at the small gesture. It was progress. After eating, he knocked on her door again. "Thank you for the meal, Katherine." "You're welcome," came her reply. "I'm sorry it wasn't more substantial." "It was perfect after a long day." He hesitated, then added, "Would you mind if we talked for a while, just like this, through the door?" There was a pause. "I suppose that would be all right." Lincoln pulled up a chair from the hallway table and sat outside her door. "Tell me about Boston," he suggested. And so began their unusual courtship. Each evening, Lincoln would sit outside Katherine's door and they would talk. She told him of her childhood in Boston, the daughter of a bookbinder who had instilled in her a love of literature. She spoke of her years teaching in a small school until her father's death left her with few prospects. "The advertisement seemed like Providence," she admitted on their fifth evening of conversation. "I had no family left, little money, and the school was hiring younger teachers. When I saw your letter seeking a bride, it felt like an answer to my prayers." "And now," Lincoln asked, leaning his head against the doorframe, "now I wonder if I've made a terrible mistake. Not because of you," she added quickly. "You've been more patient than I could have hoped. But I'm not sure I'm suited to this life." "You haven't given yourself a chance to find out," Lincoln pointed out gently. "You've seen nothing of Texas but the train station and the road to the ranch." "I know," she said, her voice small. "I'm being foolish, not foolish, afraid." "There's a difference." In turn, Lincoln told Katherine about his life on the ranch, about growing up as the only child of hard-working parents, about losing his mother to fever and his father to a heart that simply gave out. He spoke of his dreams for the ranch, expanding the herd, building a better barn, perhaps growing crops on the eastern section of the property. "It sounds like a good life," Katherine said one night, her voice wistful. "It can be," Lincoln agreed. "Hard but good." A week passed this way, their conversations growing longer and more personal. Lincoln found himself rushing through his daily tasks so he could return to the house and talk with Katherine. He came to know the sound of her footsteps as she moved around her room, the cadence of her laugh when he shared a humorous story, the thoughtful silence that followed his more serious questions. On the 10th day, Lincoln brought a book from town, a collection of poetry by Emily Dickinson. "The shopkeeper said it's new," he told Katherine through the door. "I thought you might enjoy it." "Emily Dickinson. Oh, I adore her work," Katherine said, her voice brightening. "But how will you give it to me?" Lincoln considered this. "I could slide it under the door." "It might be damaged," she worried. After a moment's thought, Lincoln said, "I'll leave it on the hallway table and go outside for a while. You can retrieve it when I'm gone." "Thank you, Lincoln. That's very kind." When Lincoln returned an hour later, the book was gone from the table. That night, their conversation centered on poetry, with Katherine reading aloud passages that particularly moved her. Her voice, when engaged with literature, lost its fearful edge and took on a warmth that made Lincoln wish all the more to see her face as she spoke. 2 weeks after Katherine's arrival, Lincoln knocked on her door with a proposal. "I've been thinking, Katherine. Would you be willing to come sit on the porch this evening? You needn't go any further than that, and I'll stay in the yard if it makes you more comfortable. But the sunset is particularly beautiful from there, and the fresh air would do you good." The silence that followed was so long that Lincoln thought she might have fallen asleep, Finally, her voice came uncertain. I don't know, Lincoln. Just think about it, he said. The offer stands whenever you're ready. That evening, as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Lincoln sat on the porch steps, whittling a small piece of wood. He had almost given up hope when he heard the front door creak open behind him. Lincoln didn't turn around, afraid of startling her. He heard the soft sound of her footsteps on the wooden porch, then the creak of the rocking chair as she settled into it. "The sunset is beautiful," Katherine said softly. Lincoln glanced over his shoulder. She was sitting in the chair, her hands folded in her lap, her face turned toward the brilliant oranges and purples painting the western sky. She wore a simple blue dress, her hair loose around her shoulders. She was beautiful in the fading light, more so than he had remembered from their brief meeting at the train station. "It is," he agreed, turning back to the horizon to give her space. "This is my favorite time of day on the ranch." Everything slows down. Even the cattle seem to pause and appreciate the view. They sat in companionable silence as the sun sank below the horizon and the first stars appeared. Lincoln continued his whittling, occasionally glancing at Katherine, who seemed to relax more with each passing minute. "What are you making?" she asked eventually, nodding toward the wood in his hands. Lincoln held up the small figure. "A horse. Not a very good one, I'm afraid. My father was much more skilled at this than I am." Katherine smiled, the first real smile he had seen from her. "It looks like a horse to me." "Would you like to have it?" he offered. She hesitated, then nodded. Lincoln placed the wooden horse on the porch railing and stepped back, allowing her to retrieve it when she felt comfortable. This became their new routine. Each evening, Katherine would join Lincoln on the porch, sitting in the rocking chair while he sat on the steps. They would talk until darkness fell, then she would return to her room for the night. Gradually, Katherine began to venture further. First to the garden beside the house, where Lincoln showed her the vegetables he had planted. Then to the chicken coop, where she collected eggs in the morning. She still retreated to her room for much of the day, but each excursion lasted longer than the one before. One morning, Lincoln was repairing a wagon wheel when Katherine appeared at the barn doorway. She wore a simple dress and a wide-brimmed hat to shield her face from the sun. "May I watch?" she asked. Lincoln nodded, surprised but pleased. "Of course." She sat on a hay bale, observing as he worked. "You're very skilled with your hands." "Necessity," Lincoln explained. "Out here, you learn to fix things yourself or do without." "I admire that," Katherine said. "In Boston, we called tradesmen for every broken item." "I never learned to be self-sufficient." "You're learning now," Lincoln pointed out. "I saw you mending one of the curtains yesterday." Katherine smiled. "It was poorly done, but yes, I tried." As September gave way to October, the weather cooled and Katherine's confidence grew. She began helping with meals, revealing herself to be a competent if inexperienced cook. They ate together at the kitchen table now, though she still retired to her room immediately after, her sanctuary when the world became too overwhelming. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Katherine broached the subject they had both been avoiding. "Lincoln, I know you brought me here to be your wife, and I've been nothing but a burden." Lincoln shook his head. "That's not true, Katherine." "It is," she insisted. "You've been patient beyond measure, but we can't continue indefinitely in this limbo. I promised to be your wife, yet I've failed to fulfill that promise." Lincoln turned to face her fully. "Katherine, when I placed that advertisement, I was seeking companionship as much as marriage. These past weeks, getting to know you through our conversations, seeing your courage as you've slowly ventured out into this new world that's been more meaningful than I could have imagined." Katherine's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "You deserve more." "Perhaps we both do," Lincoln said gently. But I'm willing to wait until you're ready, whatever form our relationship takes." Katherine was silent for a long moment, then said, "There's something I haven't told you, something that happened in Boston before I left." Lincoln waited patiently as she gathered her thoughts. "I was engaged once before," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "to a man named Thomas, a fellow teacher. We were to be married last spring, but 2 weeks before the wedding I discovered he had been involved with another woman. When I confronted him, he became enraged." Her hand unconsciously rose to her cheek. "He struck me, hard enough to leave a mark that took weeks to fade. He apologized profusely afterward, blamed the drink, promised it would never happen again." Lincoln felt a cold anger building within him at the thought of someone hurting her, but he kept his expression neutral, not wanting to frighten her. "I broke the engagement," Katherine continued, "but Thomas wouldn't accept it. He began appearing at the school, at my home, sending increasingly threatening notes. The authorities were reluctant to intervene. He came from an influential family. That's when I saw your advertisement. It seemed like the perfect escape, a new start thousands of miles away." "And now you're afraid I'll turn out to be like him," Lincoln said softly, understanding dawning. Katherine nodded. "Not because of anything you've done. You've been nothing but kind. But I find myself waiting for the moment when the kindness ends, when the true nature emerges. I know it's unfair to you." Lincoln considered his words carefully before speaking. "Katherine, I can't promise I'll never disappoint you or that we'll never disagree, but I can promise that I will never, ever strike you in anger or try to control you through fear. That's not the kind of man my parents raised me to be." "I believe you," Katherine said, and for the first time, Lincoln felt she truly might. "But belief isn't the same as trust. Trust is what I'm struggling to rebuild. Then we'll build it together, one day at a time." Lincoln stood, brushing wood shavings from his pants. "It's getting cold. Shall we go inside?" That night marked a turning point. Katherine still kept her door closed at night, but during the day she began to fully participate in the life of the ranch. She worked alongside Lincoln in the garden, learned to milk the cow, and even rode out with him on a gentle mare to see the furthest pastures. Her fear hadn't disappeared, but she was confronting it rather than allowing it to confine her. As October progressed, they settled into a companionable routine. In the evenings, they would read aloud to each other from the small collection of books Lincoln had acquired from town. Sometimes they played checkers at the kitchen table, Katherine proving to be a formidable opponent who rarely made the same mistake twice. One Sunday, Lincoln suggested they attend services in town. "It would give you a chance to meet some of the other women in the area," he said. "Mrs. Johnson, the blacksmith's wife, has asked about you several times." Katherine hesitated only briefly before nodding. "I think I'd like that." The following Sunday, they drove the wagon into Kingfisher. Katherine wore her best dress and a nervous expression. Lincoln could see her tension mounting as they approached the small white church at the end of the town's main street. "We don't have to stay if it becomes too much," he assured her as he helped her down from the wagon. Katherine squeezed his hand in silent thanks. The service passed without incident, and afterward, several townspeople approached to introduce themselves. Mrs. Johnson, a robust woman with a kind face, immediately took Katherine under her wing. "You must join us for our ladies' sewing circle on Wednesday," she insisted. "Nothing formal, just a chance for the women to gather and share news while we work." To Lincoln's surprise, Katherine agreed. "I would like that very much." On the ride back to the ranch, Katherine seemed lighter somehow. They were all so welcoming, she marveled. "Even knowing I came as a mail-order bride. Half the marriages in this territory began that way," Lincoln told her. Mrs. Johnson herself came from St. Louis to marry the blacksmith after exchanging letters for 6 months. Katherine laughed, a sound that had become more frequent and that Lincoln treasured each time he heard it. And here I thought I was unusual. "Oh, you are," Lincoln assured her with a smile, "but not for that reason." The sewing circle became a weekly engagement for Katherine, providing her with friendship and connection beyond the ranch. She returned from these gatherings full of stories and new ideas, her confidence growing with each visit to town. In early November, Lincoln received word that a band of cattle rustlers had been operating in the area. That evening, as they sat by the fire, he shared his concerns with Katherine. "I need to ride out with some of the other ranchers tomorrow to check the northern border of our property." "It might be a long day." Katherine nodded, her expression serious. "Will it be dangerous?" "I don't expect trouble," Lincoln assured her. "It's mostly precautionary, but I'll have my rifle just in case." That night, as Lincoln prepared for bed in his room down the hall, he heard a soft knock on his door. He opened it to find Katherine standing there, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. "Is everything all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said, though she looked uncertain. I wanted to say that you should be careful tomorrow. I would be very distressed if anything happened to you." Lincoln was touched by her concern. "I'll be careful, I promise." Katherine nodded then, in a gesture that surprised them both. She stood on tiptoe and placed a quick kiss on his cheek before turning and hurrying back to her room. Lincoln stood in his doorway, his hand rising to touch the spot where her lips had been, a smile spreading across his face. The following day, Lincoln rode out with 3 neighboring ranchers. They found no sign of the rustlers, but agreed to increase patrols along their shared boundaries. It was late when Lincoln returned, the house dark except for a single lamp burning in the kitchen window. He found Katherine asleep at the table, her head resting on her folded arms. A plate of food, now cold, sat waiting for him. Lincoln gently touched her shoulder. "Katherine, I'm back." She woke with a start, relief flooding her face when she saw him. "You're safe." "As promised," he said, taking a seat across from her. "I'm sorry to be so late." "I was worried," she admitted. "Mrs. Johnson told me stories about rustlers shooting ranchers who confronted them." "We didn't see any sign of trouble," Lincoln assured her. "Just tracks that were probably made by strays." Katherine pushed the plate toward him. "Your dinner is cold. I can heat it up." "It's fine as it is. Thank you for waiting up." They sat together as Lincoln ate, Katherine telling him about her day to distract herself from her lingering worry. When he finished, Lincoln insisted on washing his own dish despite Katherine's protests. "You should get some sleep," he told her. "It's late." Katherine nodded but made no move to leave. Instead, she watched him as he dried his hands on a towel, her expression thoughtful. "Lincoln," she said finally, "I've been thinking about our situation." He turned to face her. "Oh, yes." She took a deep breath. "We've been living in this strange arrangement for almost 3 months now. You've been patient beyond what anyone could expect, and I've come to care for you deeply." Lincoln's heart quickened at her words. "I care for you too, Katherine." "I know," she said softly. "And that's why I think it's time we discussed our future more concretely. I came here to be your wife, and while I'm still working through my fears, I don't want to keep you waiting indefinitely." Lincoln moved to sit beside her at the table. "Katherine, I don't want you to feel pressured. If we marry, I want it to be because you truly desire it, not because you feel obligated." "It's not obligation," Katherine assured him. "It's gratitude, yes, but also respect and affection. You've shown me what a good man truly is, Lincoln. You've given me space to heal and courage to move forward." Lincoln took her hand in his, marveling at how natural it felt. "Then what are you proposing, Miss Anderson?" A smile tugged at her lips. "I'm proposing that we set a date, Mr. Zachary. perhaps Christmas. It would give me a bit more time to prepare, and it seems a hopeful time to begin a new chapter. Christmas, Lincoln repeated, joy spreading through him. I think that would be perfect. The weeks leading up to Christmas were filled with preparations, both for the wedding and for the winter ahead. Lincoln built additional shelves in the kitchen to accommodate Catherine's growing collection of preserves, a skill she had learned from Mrs. Johnson. Catherine, in turn, transformed the main bedroom, moving in her belongings and adding touches that made the space feel like theirs rather than just his. She still maintained her separate room, but the door remained open now, no longer a barrier but simply another space in their home. At night, they would say goodnight in the hallway between their rooms, sometimes with a gentle kiss that held the promise of more to come. Word of their impending marriage spread through Kingfisher, and the townspeople embraced the news with enthusiasm. Gifts began arriving at the ranch: handmade quilts, preserved foods, a rocking chair crafted by the blacksmith. Catherine was overwhelmed by the generosity. I never expected this, she told Lincoln as they unwrapped a set of china cups sent by the doctor's wife. In Boston, people were more reserved, especially with newcomers. Small towns are different, Lincoln explained. Everyone depends on each other out here. Your joy is our joy, your hardship our hardship. The wedding was set for Christmas Eve, with the ceremony to be held in the church, followed by a small gathering at the ranch. Catherine, with the help of Mrs. Johnson and several other women from town, prepared the house, decorating with pine boughs and ribbons, baking pies and cakes that filled the kitchen with delicious aromas. The night before the wedding, a light snow began to fall, unusual for Texas, but welcomed as a good omen. Lincoln and Catherine stood on the porch, watching the flakes drift down in the lantern light. "Are you nervous?" Lincoln asked, his arm around her shoulders. "A little," Catherine admitted, "but not afraid, not anymore." Lincoln pulled her closer. "I was thinking about the first weeks after you arrived, when you wouldn't leave your room. Did you ever imagine we'd be here now, about to be married?" Catherine smiled up at him. "No, I couldn't see past my fear then. But you were so patient, talking to me through that door, getting to know me without pushing. You courted me properly, Lincoln Zachary, even if it was through an oak door." Lincoln laughed. "Well, it worked, didn't it?" "It did," she agreed, resting her head against his shoulder. "Tomorrow I become Mrs. Zachary. I like the sound of that." The wedding day dawned clear and cold, the snow glistening in the morning sun. Catherine dressed in a new gown of deep blue, sewn by the women of the sewing circle as a wedding gift. Lincoln wore his best suit, purchased from the general store and altered by Mrs. Johnson to fit his tall frame. The church was full, not just with the residents of Kingfisher, but with ranchers and farmers from miles around. As Catherine walked down the aisle toward Lincoln, her steps were steady, her smile radiant. The fear that had once kept her locked away was gone, replaced by confidence and love. The minister spoke of commitment and partnership, of building a life together through good times and bad. When it came time for the vows, Catherine's voice was clear and unwavering as she promised to love, honor, and cherish Lincoln. His own voice broke with emotion as he made the same promises to her. "By the power vested in me," the minister concluded, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride." Lincoln took Catherine's face gently in his hands and kissed her, a kiss that spoke of patience rewarded and love hard won. The congregation erupted in applause and cheers. The celebration at the ranch lasted well into the evening, with music provided by a fiddler from town and dancing in the cleared space of the main room. As the last guests departed, leaving the newlyweds alone, Lincoln locked the front door and turned to his wife. "Mrs. Zachary," he said, taking her hands in his. "Welcome home." Catherine's eyes shone with happiness. "I've been home for some time now, Mr. Zachary. I just didn't realize it until you helped me find the courage to step outside my door." That night, Catherine moved permanently into their shared bedroom, leaving behind the room that had once been both prison and sanctuary. As they lay together in the darkness, Lincoln whispered, "Was it worth the journey, Catherine, coming all this way to marry a stranger?" She nestled closer to him, her head on his shoulder. "To marry a stranger, I'm not sure, but to marry you, Lincoln Zachary, yes, it was worth every mile and every moment of fear." Spring came early to Kingfisher in 1876, bringing new life to the ranch. The cattle thrived under Lincoln's care, and Catherine's garden flourished, providing vegetables for their table and extras to sell in town. Catherine had taken over the bookkeeping for the ranch, her neat figures and careful planning helping to increase their profits. In April, Catherine shared news that filled Lincoln with joy. They were expecting a child in the fall. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, with Catherine maintaining her activities around the ranch until the later months when Lincoln insisted she rest more. Their son, James, was born on a crisp October day, with Mrs. Johnson serving as midwife. He had Lincoln's dark hair and Catherine's bright eyes, a perfect blend of them both. As Catherine held their son in her arms, Lincoln beside her on the bed, she marveled at how far she had come from that frightened woman who had arrived on the train. "If I had stayed behind that door," she said softly, "I would have missed all of this." "But you didn't stay there," Lincoln reminded her, kissing her forehead. "You found your courage." "With your help," Catherine added. "You waited for me, Lincoln. You gave me time to heal." As the years passed, the Zachary family grew. A daughter, Elizabeth, joined them 2 years after James, followed by another son, Thomas, named not for Catherine's former fiancé but for Lincoln's father, reclaiming the name for something good and honorable. The ranch prospered, expanding to include more cattle and horses. Lincoln built a larger house when the children outgrew the original, but they kept the old one standing, a reminder of where their story had begun. Catherine became a respected member of the community, eventually starting a small school on the ranch for their children and those of neighboring families. The frightened woman who had once been too terrified to leave her room now rode confidently across the ranch, taught classes full of boisterous children, and stood proudly beside her husband at community gatherings. On their 20th anniversary, Lincoln presented Catherine with a gift, a small wooden box he had crafted himself. Inside lay the handle from her bedroom door, polished and mounted on a small plaque. "What's this?" Catherine asked, puzzled. Lincoln smiled. "It's the door handle you once kept between us, the one I talked through for weeks while courting you. I saved it when we replaced the doors in the old house." Catherine ran her fingers over the worn brass. "I was so afraid then. And now?" She looked up at him, her eyes filled with the love that had grown steadily through 2 decades of marriage. "Now I can't imagine a single door I wouldn't walk through with you beside me." That night, as they sat on the porch of their home, watching their children play in the yard and the sun setting over the land they had nurtured together, Catherine leaned her head against Lincoln's shoulder, just as she had on so many evenings before. "Do you ever think about how differently our lives might have turned out?" she asked. "If I had given in to my fears and returned to Boston," Lincoln considered the question. "Sometimes, but I believe we were meant to find each other, Catherine. Even if it took talking through a door for weeks to begin our journey." Catherine laughed, the sound as delightful to Lincoln as it had been the first time he heard it. "Our unusual courtship. I wouldn't change it, you know. Every step brought us here." "And here is exactly where we belong," Lincoln said, drawing her closer as the stars began to appear in the Texas sky. In the years that followed, as their children grew and began families of their own, as Kingfisher expanded from a small settlement to a proper town, Lincoln and Katherine Zachary remained a testament to the power of patience and the courage it takes to open doors both literal and figurative. Their story became something of a legend in the county, the tale of the mail-order bride too afraid to leave her room and the cowboy who courted her through the door, a reminder that love sometimes arrives in unexpected ways, but is no less profound for the unusual path it takes.